In 1989, James O'Barr created a comic book to help himself purge the trauma of his fiancee's death. It would be published by Caliber Comics and go on to be a cult classic in the comic book genre. And since it was popular, of course Hollywood came calling. O'Barr was ambivalent, not least because it was something he created out of very personal pain. And there was always the fact that Hollywood had not shown itself to be overly good at being able to adapt comic books to the big screen in a faithful way to that point. This was well before the halcyon days of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Back in 1994, when you can count the number of really well done comic book movies on your hands and have fingers left over. But Paramount was going to do it whether O'Barr was involved or not. Given the original pitch for the movie was for it to be a musical starring Michael Jackson, it was probably better he was. Things got dicey once more when it came time for casting. O'Barr was not keen on the studio's choice of Brandon Lee, son of legendary action film star Bruce Lee. To that point, Brandon Lee had only been in foreign productions of a martial arts/action flavor, and 2 movies in the United States. Showdown in Little Tokyo was what it sounds like, a cheesy 90s action movie starring Dolph Lundgren. Lee's filmography got better with his next film, Rapid Fire, but it was still 90s action cheese. Nothing that would presage his ability to convey the heavy-natured material of The Crow into something that would honor the source material. With the producers locked in a battle over whether to cast Christian Slater or River Phoenix, Lee was a consensus candidate. One that James Barr was less than thrilled over. He envisioned his work being adapted into some brainless, straight-to-video schlock nobody would watch. Brandon Lee, however, was able to win O'Barr over and put his entire being into making sure he did justice to O'Barr's work. 2 tragic ends. Brandon Lee wound up being killed on set while filming an action scene in which he wound up being struck by an improperly made and improvised dummy round from a prop gun. He was rushed to the hospital but died shortly thereafter. There were calls to stop filming and simply scrap the movie. Paramount backed out of the movie due to the delays the death caused, which is when Miramax swooped in and not only intended to release it to theaters, but pumped an additional $8 million into the production so there would be rewrites around the few scenes they had left to film. Brandon Lee had finished most of his scenes, and Lee's stunt double, Chad Stahelski, stood in for him in what scenes needed Eric Draven to work. While the film wound up becoming a financial success, making $93 million on a $23 million budget, and achieve cult classic status, James O'Barr said of Brandon Lee's death that it was like his fiance's death all over, and he regretted ever writing The Crow in the first place. Like the comic book, The Crow was a brooding, vivid, impactful film. There was an air about the movie as you watched it that made you feel what few movies, especially in modern Hollywood, make you feel. Namely, that this is the art at its grittiest best. The characters were rich and dense with meaning. The setting loomed over those characters as if it, too, was a character with agency in the story. The soundtrack complemented that feeling, making sure the immersion was complete. And the story was at once simple, yet profound in its telling. It was a masterpiece of writing, acting, directing, cinematography, and producing that all came together to ensure the opus magnum of Brandon Lee's acting career and the cause of his death had the impact it deserved, not only for Brandon Lee, but James O'Barr, whose sanity was put on the line not only to create the source material, but then again when the man who embodied that creation was killed trying to bring it forth for a broader audience. In the years following the original Crow, multiple straight-to-video movies of much lesser quality were made, as well as a television series starring Mark Dacascos in 1998. While none of those efforts came even within sniffing distance of being as good as The Crow, none of them were overtly offensive, and only the television series actually used the character of Eric Draven. Then 2008 came around, and Hollywood was entering its current phase. It is a phase marked by creative bankruptcy of the lowest order. Back then, it was not so pronounced that normies noticed, but it was there. And in that spirit, creatives lacking the ability to judge their own ideas' merit began fiddling with the idea of quote-unquote reimagining The Crow. The original vision for this was for the project to ignore the gothic and stylized nature of the original film, or even the source material, and instead try to do a Crow movie that would be quote-unquote realistic, hard-edged, and mysterious, almost documentary style. Because what a movie about a dude and his fiancée getting killed and him coming back from the dead to avenge them needs is realism and documentary stylistic choices. Over the years that followed, the spawn point for this monstrosity, innumerable actors were floated as being the star for this new Crow adaptation. Everyone from Bradley Cooper to James McAvoy to Channing Tatum to Nicholas Hoult to Jason Momoa were reported to be in consideration to play the revived Eric Draven. And just as there were innumerable actors linked to the project, the same goes with the writers and directors. Year after year passed, more and more actors, writers, and directors were floated, and this idea was still stillborn. In 2020, the idea of rebooting the film was once more revived. Attendant delays for the pandemic meant that it wasn't until 2022 that filming began. And this is where things began to get ominous for fans of both the comic book and Brandon Lee's The Crow. Why? Because both filming and post-production were finished by the end of 2022. And then it sat. And sat. And sat. For over a year, the film sat with nobody getting a look at it. And then, in February of 2024, we got a look at what they did to The Crow as photos of Bill Skarsgård as The Crow were released, and more details were becoming known to the broader public. And none of it was reassuring. The cast was less than promising. The look was not even close to what The Crow should look like, whether you base that on the comic book or the 1994 film. Even the story details were less than inspiring of confidence in what we were about to see. Add to that the fact that the film was originally supposed to be released on June 7, 2024, but was pushed back to August 21, 2024, and there was a review embargo on critics until the night before it was released, and everything was pointing to a disaster in the making. So, what was the story they were trying to sell fans of The Crow to lure them back to theaters to watch their reimagining? Two junkies meet in rehab, fall in lust, and escape. They spend the next half of the movie getting high and making out, including one gratuitously long love scene. Then Shelley's past catches up to them, and both of them are killed. After what seemed like only a couple of days, Eric, and they never use the last name Draven that I recall, stops his journey to the afterlife to go save Shelley because he loves her so much after all their time together, from damnation by killing a dude who has ties to the devil that gives him the ability to send innocents to hell. Eric, taking nearly the entire movie to get there, goes on a bloody, gore-filled rampage in the last quarter hour before leaving things rather ambiguous, hoping forlornly for a sequel. A sequel that will hopefully never come after this excrement was shat out by Lionsgate and the production companies. On a ridiculously extravagant $50 million budget, The Crow 2024 stormed into the box office in its opening weekend and brought home, wait for it, $4.6 million. $4.6 million. And honestly, that was too much. The Crow 2024 has no redeeming qualities. The acting was bad. The writing was beyond amateurish. The cinematography couldn't even scratch the original's ass for it. The directing and editing were shoddy. The fight choreography was lacking. and the CGI was the usual terribleness that makes me think Hollywood is somehow going back in time technologically. Nothing about this movie worked on any level. Even if you were to be kind and do this movie a favor, completely forgetting Brandon Lee's The Crow existed, this movie would still be warmed over dog on moldy bread. That there was nobody at any point in this production that came along and stopped it. Cutting off the budgetary spigot to prevent a financial disaster merely demonstrates that there are no intelligent businessmen left in Hollywood. The Crow 2024 may well go down in history as one of the worst film adaptations ever made. And if you know anything about the history of film adaptations, you know that is a field rife with promising candidates willing to fight to the death for that title. Nobody will come out of this project wanting to proclaim to the heavens that they were involved. It was that bad. In past eras of Hollywood, this was the type of film that would end careers and ruin studios. Welcome to modern Hollywood. Enjoy the bonfire. I've got hot dogs and marshmallows if anyone wants to join me for the show. Until next time. Tschüss.